Mark Anielski is an Edmonton-based economist specializing in the economics of well-being. He serves as president and chief well-being officer of Anielski Management, Inc., an economic consultancy dedicated to integrating happiness and well-being into economic systems. Anielski is the author of The Economics of Happiness: Building Genuine Wealth, an award-winning book that outlines his genuine wealth model, a framework for measuring progress and success through well-being indicators. He has advised various communities, including First Nations across Canada, on adopting well-being-based economic strategies. Anielski has lectured internationally, including at Harvard University and the University of Alberta, sharing his expertise on merging happiness metrics with economic analysis. His work emphasizes the importance of aligning economic practices with human and environmental well-being, advocating for a holistic approach to economic development.
That was from 2003 to 12, and it was, I think, the only place we introduced the idea of cooperative business as a structure, as an alternative to the current corporation. So I've always been a fan of different models of cooperative economies. Emilia-Romagna, of course, in Italy, knowing Stefano Zamagna, the brilliant economist and kind of one of the architects of that system of 15,000 business cooperatives working in harmony within the watershed of the Po River ecosystem. So, and of course, Alberta has a long history of cooperatives, so it shouldn't be, a surprise to us that it is part of our spirit. And I've always believed that even the basis of accounting, even though I studied accounting and accounting theory at the U of A back when I was 20, I never understood the origins of the accounting system was based in Venice during a time in the late 15th century. Luca Pacioli and Leonardo da Vinci establishing the double entry bookkeeping system for who? Not just the Medicis in Florence, who became the dominant bankers of Europe, but also for guild societies in Venice. And so guilds, of course, were cooperatives. Luca never defined the word profit. He said, being a monastic, a Franciscan mathematician and monk, said all wealth comes from God. And so all wealth does come from the Creator. And that is just a truth that's still true in accounting today. So the spirit of cooperatives being shared asset management. As Lucas said, in a guild society, there was no such thing as a profit. Maybe there was a profit like Bill, but I mean, an FIT profit. And if you look at the accounting handbook today, there's still no clear definition of that word. If there was anything left over after the disbursement to the members, and I think that's what Wayfinders represents, it was called a residual. And the residual, it was decided amongst the members to either retain it as retained earnings or to distribute it to the community at large or the poor. So an interesting kind of model for that kind of blunts this, the current neoliberal economic, predatory financial capitalism. I didn't mean to say those are all mean-spirited words or denigrate capitalism, but as Fanfani, the great Italian economist and former Prime Minister of Italy, said, capitalism is unique because it actually has no original codex, no kind of moral code. It pretends it's founded on some narrative of hedonism and greed and self-actualization, but it actually has no originality, which is incredible. So here we are in this pandemic, and we are asking ourselves, what kind of what's the economy for anyways? Why do businesses exist? If businesses don't exist for defined in part 3 of the corporate charter called best interests, corporations don't simply exist for profit maximization. They exist presumably to contribute to the well-being of the employees and community in which it serves, and hopefully it's in harmony with the ecosystem. So I know that's a long-winded introduction to why I'm a fan of cooperatives. I think there's an opportunity for a modernization of cooperatives. Maybe Wayfinders is that opportunity. I love Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. I know the Focolare movement. I've been part of that. What Gera Lubitsch started, basically, economy of love in Lopiano near Florence. There's lots of these models around the world that we can point to and say, people can actually find joy in sharing of assets. And assets is a key word in my lexicon, because asset is something that delivers future utility. And I jokingly say, what is a util anyways, if not a unit of happiness? At least economists didn't find the util, and neither did, what's his name, Stuart Mills, define utility in any clear definition. So my point in all this is, it's interesting that the language we've become used to using, wealth, means the conditions of well-being in the Old English. Economy from Aristotle, household stewardship. Ecology, the knowledge of the household. Mortgage, death pledge, all these words are still resonating with truth. And so I think the cooperative business structure has an opportunity to embrace those origins of accounting and the truths of the words that we have come to use regularly.
So Mark, if that's a great sort of framing of your thinking and the origins and the history around cooperatives and that economic thinking. Going forward, then, what's your view on cooperatives as a business model that can and should be embraced more broadly in our society? Because it's broad, I think not as well known as many of us would like to see that model happening. So, what sort of vision do you see for the future of that?
Well, one thing I've said earlier. The corporate DNA itself, the reason why corporations exist. If I pull up my legal incorporation papers from my lawyer from 1995, I don't think it says in section 3 what the best interests of Anielski management is. So at the very beginning, as a foundational value principles of why the cooperative business exists, one has to be clear, I think, about what it's going to be held accountable for, what it will contribute to, and let's imagine it actually declares we hope to have a net positive impact on well-being of society. How whether you can imagine a judge one day trying to bring you to court and say, you didn't, Bill, you failed to contribute to the happiness of, I don't know, Riverdale or something. God help us if, as a former treasurer of Strathcona Community League, if that was my mandate, I don't know. But here's the point I tried to make from the macro level. Governments right now are operating without a balance sheet, and people go, "What does that mean?" It's like, I know, because I sat on the provincial audit committee when I asked Merwin Zahara, who was the auditor general, when I joined. I said, "Show me where in the accounting handbook of the public sector where it says thou shalt not account for assets like natural resources." And sure enough, I could pull you the handbook. It's only this thick. It's not as thick as the corporate accounting handbook. It literally says, Canada will be prohibited from accounting for natural resources as assets. I said, there's the word prohibition is used. But whose interest is it that we, as public sector accountants, are prohibited for accounting for the most important assets to this province: oil, water, sunshine, trees, wildlife, traditional knowledge, indigenous culture, et cetera, et cetera. Unbelievable. And so here's my rebuke of public sector accounting. We fail to measure the assets, or the well-being, as Bobby Kennedy said, of the nation. Not only don't we measure progress properly because we use GDP like a blunt instrument of cash flow, we have no balance sheet for Alberta, which says, here are the assets, here's the carbon liabilities, right? Here's the well site liabilities, here's the mental illness as a liability. And then we construct our budgets around a proper constructed, and I'm just talking accounting here. I'm not talking crazy stuff. I'm not socialist. I'm just like 500 years of accounting, a basic fundamental violation in public sector accounting. Now, can cooperative business groups become a model for showing governments how to do this? Can Indigenous nations who I work with now become models of this new economic structure where MNP produces a proper balance sheet for Enoch or a Pasquik Cree Nation who I work with? If they won't do it, then I'll get another accounting firm from Europe who's willing to do it. Because all we have to do now is set precedent. And the same true for cooperative business. So produce a proper balance sheet. Ask yourself, what are the assets that are under our management? That assets are delivering some type of well-being benefit to both the members of the cooperative, but to those we are serving in terms of our goods and services that we're providing. And all of this can be done in the existing accounting structure, and most certainly needs to be scaled up to the city level, to the provincial level, and to the national level.
So Mark, this is your genuine wealth accounting model that you're talking about there. Can you tell us sort of break down the model a bit more and how it would be ideally suited for a business cooperative like this?
So the model basically says, and there's nothing original under the sun. I actually took this idea of 5 capitals from, I think it was my alma mater, PwC. I worked for Coopers and Lybrand when I started in this world of business when I was 21 here at Edmonton. Articling 1981, when you know what happened, economic disaster, and they laid off like half the young accountants. And I went into forestry. I don't know why. I thought hugging trees was way better than auditing PCL, which we were doing. And see how successful PCL has become. And but joking aside, so let's say there's at least 5 forms of capital: human capital, or human. Now, when I use capital, interesting, if you look up the word, I love the etymological dictionary, because if you look up the word capital, one of the definitions is a form of wealth created in some form. So I've just said the word wealth from the Old English means the conditions of well-being. Adam Smith never defined the word wealth because he was Scottish. He was probably mad at the English or something. That's my joke, right? It's a bad joke. But not once does Adam Smith define wealth in The Wealth of Nations as the conditions of well-being from the 13th century Old English. So here I'm going, like, I have to peel back all the stuff I learned in accounting theory and financial accounting and say, if, let's say, there are these other asset classes, and class, you know this too, right? There's human capital, our health, our joy, our happiness. Like, these are subjective attributes of well-being. But I can measure Bill's blood pressure. I can do a full diagnostic on Bill. And yet a good GP is going to ask Bill, how's your marriage, Bill? How are your kids? How's your dog? You know, do you have a happy workplace? Because those are all nuanced things. Those are intangibles that matter to your well-being. Then there's social capital or cultural capital, which is relationships, trust, belonging, sense of community. Again, they're all subjective in a sense. But can we measure trust? Absolutely. Do I trust Klaus? Yeah, so far. How razor thin is trust? How fragile is trust, right? These things can be measured by asking people, as I'm doing my surveys, how much do you trust your neighbor? How many neighbors do you know by first name? And then the third form of capital is natural capital: forests, wetlands, ecological health, the state of moose and natural medicines, and right, a lot of the stuff known by indigenous people because they have relationship with creation, so they could tell you how the caribou are doing. So the natural capital accounts are important: the subsoil assets, oil and gas and coal and all those other things, and the liabilities associated with the extraction of natural resources. And then we have built capital, infrastructure. You know, this house I'm sitting in 1909, you know, still standing. And those assets too have a characteristic of providing utility, right? I mean, you know, at some point, all life is maintenance, so infrastructure needs to be maintained. But we treat capital or infrastructure like, well, we put a depreciation schedule on it. It's like, well, the computer depreciates at 30% a year. Oh, by the way, my solar panels on the garage do too, the same kind of depreciation allowance. But is that really a proxy for the utility of the asset? I don't think so. And then the fifth capital, of course, is just money itself. Well, that's the biggest joke of all, because money is something that we created. Money is an agreement. You know, money today is all debt money, all created by loans by banks. 95% of all money is created by loans, and that's part of the problem we're in right now in this existential economic crisis. So there's those 5 forms of capital. They talk to each other. They're interrelated. The state of the natural environment is as important to human well-being as it is to social assets and social. And these 5 capital accounts can be maintained at any scale you want. At a household level, I mean, it may be a little more complicated. I just got to ask my kids, you know, how hopeful are you today about tomorrow or next in September? How happy do you feel? What does that have to do with anything, how happy I feel? A lot, because if you have a living wage, you're going to be happier, you're going to be less stressed. So these are things that we pay attention to at different accounting scales or enterprise reporting levels. So 5Capital's in a corporation. I've worked that out with Suncor when I first helped them on their sustainability report, with the City of Edmonton, with the Opaskwayak Cree Nation now, and Comox in Vancouver Island, with China, who adopted Xiaokang. Xiaokang means well-being in the Confucian terms for China's national economic strategy. And so you can kind of see that these 5Capital counts scale up all the way up, including into the operations of central banks like the Bank of Canada, in theory. Right? In practice, that's not happening, but in theory, it could happen.
So taking that model then of your genuine wealth and looking at all those 5 elements, and given the situation we're in with the COVID pandemic, what gives you hope for Canada's future, and ways that with the economic fallout that there could be some transition around our money system, credit union, and banking models in general?
Well, before COVID happened, for fun, I took New Zealand's well-being budget, Jacinda Ardern, under a coalition government tabled and I wrote one for Canada just for fun, because I used to help write budget speeches when I was in the Alberta government under Jim Dinning and Ralph Klein, and also for Paul Martin once. And I said, I'm just going to have fun and write Canada's well-being budget 2020. And I put it up on my site. No one visits my site. Very few people visit my LinkedIn posts, but whatever, I just did it for fun. Well, I got a call from the chief of staff to the new associate finance minister, Mona Fortier, and also Minister of Middle Class Prosperity. I almost choked. I'm like, middle class? Is the middle class an endangered species? Like when Mr. Trudeau writes a mandate letter for Mona and says, go out and find out what New Zealand and all these female leaders in Iceland and Scotland are doing about this well-being budgeting. I'm like, wow, that's unbelievable. So the good news is, even before COVID hit, I was speaking with the chief of staff, and Bill, you know what it's like to be a chief of staff, and you're trying to deal with the bureaucrats, and we're talking about finance people, right? They're not like squishy about happiness and stuff. So I said, I don't know about Jacinda, but she's got some she's actually a really gifted politician, and she's been on the Steve Colbert show, and makes him laugh. So she's got to be, I don't know what she's doing, but she's doing great things. And then I talked to my friend, Marilyn Waring. We know Marilyn Waring is. And I said, Marilyn, you must be thrilled that New Zealand's adopting this well-being bills. She goes, I was initially, but I resigned. I protested. I said, what? And so she said, and I wrote my follow-up book, my sequel. Her first book was called Counting for Nothing as If Women Mattered. And she said, 30 years later, I wrote this little thin book called Still Counting, saying we are not measuring well-being holistically. We are not measuring well-being of women. We're just adopting the OECD well-being indicators. So as part of this story, so I said to the chief of staff, look, I will give you ideas. Here's my idea. I said, I would consider adopting not because I'm self-serving, but I would consider adopting a full asset-based accounting model for Canada that maybe adopts some of the attributes of New Zealand and Iceland, not just picking indicators at random, but within an accounting structure that says, when we measure wealth, we're going to measure the conditions of well-being. And we're going to measure well-being conditions across the whole country by age cohort, by sex, by income. And we could then construct a budget in which our programs and services and our capital and operating budgets are somehow linked to the impact on well-being of the nation. That was my idea. So 2 weeks ago, of course, self-isolating in Ottawa with her 3 kids, she calls me again and said, we're now in a hurried up offense. We have to now produce an emergency budget before March 2021. And can you provide us with some ideas? So, we being my friend Giannis, who's chief economist with Suzuki Foundation, he says, I'm pulling together a document called Building Back Better. And of course, Bill, you know, if you're a chief of staff, you would never allow me to say this out loud, right? Publicly before it's even announced. Anyways, this is just a policy idea sketch. It says, designing and implementing a post-pandemic well-being focused economic system for Canada. It's just a thought piece. It's if they take any of it, it'll be the most incredible progressive move of any nation beyond what New Zealand's doing. Do I have hope? Absolutely. I said to Lucy, if I was really bold, if I was a finance minister right now, I would have all my economists conducting a national inventory of the well-being conditions of the Canadians, including how we're feeling, how much money we really need to live right now. Is it 20 bucks an hour, which is a happiness wage for a 2-income family? Is that $2,000 a month enough? Is a $40,000 small business grant enough or loan? Because it's a loan. Don't know. Let's find out. What's the monthly burn rate of Canadians right now so they don't despair? And oh, by the way, what I would do if I was the new Bank of Canada governor who's coming in, I'd bring back Mark Carney. Come on, Mark, you're going to the UN, but why don't you stop into Edmonton where you're raised? And let's accelerate a well-being based central bank financial policy in which we return the central bank's power back to 1974, when Trudeau and other leaders gave up the power of government debt to the private banks and the private sector so they could buy the debt. Thank you very much. Just like what happens with Alberta, by the way. All that debt we just issue in bonds, who buys it? The controller tells me, the markets. I said, no, even when I go to Starbucks, my name's on the invoice. You can't tell me $10 billion just went to the anonymous markets. But this is the truth of what's going on. And so I said, if you want me really bold, I would restore the powers of the central bank to make money in a form of public utility. Just like water coming out of your tap. That doesn't mean a free lunch. It doesn't mean that I embrace universal basic income per se. Because I think people get dignity from work. We're going to get bored pretty quickly just getting the check in the bank. Anyways, that's where my hope is. So I'm just giving you advanced warning that maybe something is coming. And the other good news that gives me hope is my Indigenous friends, First Nations, distinct nations who can lead on this well-being economy on their own, including financial self-determination. And there's a few that understand this is not an act of war or revenge. This is a sovereign wealth move by these nations.
So Mark, that's the questions that you and I had talked in advance about, but I think it would be interesting for everyone to hear you go a little bit more in depth about the work you're doing with the Indigenomics Institute and that particular piece around what things look like for these communities post-pandemic, because there is that relationship that everyone's trying to figure out going forward as all people of signatories to treaties. So we are all treaty signatories at the end of the day. So understanding that transition, I think, is going to be very important looking forward. And then we'll open it up for everyone else to ask questions. So, but if you can give us some sense of what you're working on.
So I am not Indigenous. I am the son of a German immigrant. And so I have no claim to Turtle Island or Ganata. Lewis Cardinal tells me means peaceful or sacred place. Wow. And so Lewis and I have been friends for a long time. Some of you met Lewis. And I said, what was Edmonton like 5,000 years ago? And he goes, Edmonton was known as the Great Pehonen. In fact, in the word Edmonton is the Cree word Monto, which means great spirit. And in Donald Ross Flats, down the river where we just went cycling, was one of the greatest trading areas on Turtle Island. Right, Jared Diamond said, the edge of the great continental ice sheet here, in an ancient kind of economy. And I'll raise my little like show and tell. These are like seashells that when I went to Tahiti to work with the Tahitians on their well-being index, they laden me with these shells, 40 pounds of these things. But this was money in the shell-based economic systems in which people would gather here in Edmonton. So that to say that I've always I've now been intrigued by this ancient economic system in which shells were a form of money, which shell money originates with the indigenous Taiwanese, which the Chinese then adopt as coinage. So what does that have to do with indigenomics? So Caroline Hilton, who is this remarkable young woman from the New Channel Nation, so the Whale people on just north of Tofino, very remote, no access, just north of Tofino, known as the Whale people, raised in a foster home. Her father was Hilton, who is a very well-known BC surgeon. She and I met a few years ago, and we had this, like, one of those, like, we got to work together. And she said, I've come up with a word, indigenomics, hashtag indigenomics. I said, what does it mean? Says, it means whatever you want it to mean. Actually, then she goes on to write a whole book about it. What is indigenomics? Is a way of being and thinking the way indigenous cultures have thought for 10,000 years. The potlatch. What was the potlatch? A ceremony of gifting, an over gifting of wealth from Bill's family to everybody else in the neighborhood, then my family, as if kind of a joke, reflecting the fact that nature is abundant. So the laws of nature then revealed in the potlatch. So indigenomics is about, as she says, setting the table for a renewed relationship between all treaty people, and BC nations are not treaty, right? So that's interesting. And our work now is to really test and prototype these well-being economic and governance systems and budgeting systems in which we can say the aspiration of the Indigenous economy of Canada is, as TD said, $100 billion. And the last count was 32 billion. I said, it's just a number, who cares? But it's a flashy number. You know, people in our world love big numbers. So you say it's 100 billion, it sounds impressive. It's not actually that big on a per capita basis. But the cool thing is these Indigenous cultures, when I say the word genuine, I know it's a loaded word, but it means it's aligned with the values and principles and laws of a culture. The triumph of Rome and Britain was the codification of laws, which Indigenous people did not have. They didn't codify laws. Now they have our opportunity to codify their laws, not their spiritual laws, but their laws of nature, of governance, on which then a well-being accounting system can be constructed. So the assets of the nation, then, what we're doing is going and inventorying. This is the basic of accounting. You take inventory before you do, that's part of the audit. So we look at how people are feeling. I'm doing a survey right now, a well-being survey for the Apostle Cree Nation, which are 6,500 people, led by Christian Sinclair, who calls himself not chief, but Onikanau, which means leader. Leader for this time. He's got a 2-year mandate. But he's a former Canadian military sniper. He knows war. So he's like, let's go. You read my book? I said, we're going. We're going to move. And I said, where are we going? So we're going to adopt everything you've written about in your book. Okay. So we're going to do a complete inventory, build a balance sheet, construct a budget based on well-being, show it to the feds. So right? We just had the reset, April 1st, reset. And we're going to be able to account for the value of government transfers to that First Nation in terms of improving well-being conditions, verified by subjective well-being surveys where I ask people, how much joy do they feel? How much hope do your children feel? All the way from, grade 6 to 90-year-olds. And guess what? Subjective perception is reality, right? So this is the exciting part, which is what Caroline and I are working on. And she's a remarkable woman. She's got the ear of many leaders. She speaks like, it's almost like when you listen to her, it's almost under a trance, but she's just incredible in terms of being able to set the table, as she says, and invite us to come and play Indigenomics. So I know I'm long-winded, but I've learned from Indigenous people, you tell stories. And
yeah, no, that's super exciting, Mark. I'm glad you're doing that, and I'm glad you're getting that pickup from some key people to push those ideas forward in those communities and broadly across the country. So let's open it up for others to ask questions. I know we've got a number of people online. has the first one up. Rod, unmute yourself and ask a question, and then okay, and then I see Martin got his hand up after that. So Rod, go first, and then Martin, you'll be next.
Hello, Mark. Hello, Mark, and everybody here. Real
Rod.
pleasure to meet you, Mark. And I remember reading your book years ago, and I've certainly been a big follower or a big proponent, I think, of your general ideas. And you know, I mean, it's made no sense that things like, you know, the Valdez oil leak was ended up being a contribution to the GDP of the nation because of, or certainly of the American nation, because of all the costs of cleanup and all that kind of thing. So many of your ideas made sense. And I remember the 55, it was 55 indices, right, of the GPI. And I remember the criticism that emerged at that time, which was that poor lowly GDP was just one of those 55 indices. And, you know, there was some critics, I guess, believe that was totally unfair. I wonder if you would think that some indices now are more important than others. I mean, right now during the health pandemic like this, if health care, perhaps public health care might be a more important index, or, you know, some of our environmental, the natural assets that you referred to, if some of those would have a little more weight. Do you think that any of the of those 55 indices should have, or do have, or should have a different weight?
Good question, Rod. Actually, there were 51 indicators.
Okay.
I went back to 1960. Actually, I'm updating the Alberta GPI just for fun, because that's what you do when you have lots of spare time and you're self-isolated. Otherwise, I'd drive my wife crazy. But so I've been updating the 51 GPI indicators. Now, the interesting thing about the original GPI, which I worked on in the U.S., was an attempt to calculate the social and environmental costs, like oil spills, for example, or greenhouse gas emissions, which were contributing in positive GDP, but actually arguably were, you know, detracting, I would say, from well-being. But that's not the way GDP works. Any cash changing hands counts as positive. So that was the original idea of the GPI. What I did with the Alberta GPI is I did the monetization. I got criticized by all my former bosses, including the, you know, not for the monetization or attempt to monetize, you know, social costs or the value of unpaid work. I didn't get criticized for that. I got criticized for giving equal weight to the 51 indicators and aggregating them as a composite index. I'm like, I said, what the hell? That's unfair. I mean, the fact is, Albertans have never been asked what they value most. I mean, is there an annual survey that's asks us, what do you love about being an Edmontonian? You know, it's like, or how much joy you feel for your life. These subjective measures don't exist, or maybe they exist in some limited capacities that maybe the health departments measure. So the point is that whatever we define, that's where that word, when we said genuine progress indicator, we got a lot of heat in the US. Like, how dare you say that the cost of divorce is a negative cost of society? I said, well, it's good for lawyers and it creates two households and, you know, two sets of bikes for the kids or whatever and blah, blah, blah. It's great for the economy. And so we backed off. There's some moral issues here. Like, I'm not going to say that divorce wasn't good for you, right? That's preposterous. However, the point is, if we don't establish an accountancy based on what we value, and right now, so we got a crisis. What do we need right now? We need emergency income. We need to get by. We need to survive, right? Because we're scared. And I said to this chief of staff, why don't we do a quick poll? Get Environics. I've got a poll right now. You can use my poll. It's on Google Docs. Ask 2,000 Canadians how they feel about their life right now. And let's see where the most hope is in this country. Maybe it's way up north in Nunavut. I don't know. And so, but the fact is that we rely so heavily on objective statistics. Like, we believe that everything can be objectively measured, quantified. But the truth is, perception to me is reality. I'm an economist, so I love data, of course. But when I do my surveys now, I ask people, how much do you feel you make enough money? I use feeling question. I didn't say, do you think you make enough money? I said, do you feel you make enough money? And then they tell me how much money they make. Well, the data shows that actually it doesn't matter how much money or little money people make. They have relatively stable levels of happiness and life satisfaction. Isn't that interesting? And I'm not saying that, you know, a living wage or a happiness wage is around $70,000 per household income. So right now in Alberta, you know, before COVID, the average Edmonton household working couple was making about $109,000. It's hard to believe, right? $109,000 more than Calgary was. And if I said, you know, a happiness wage is $70,000, you can live on $70,000. And if you have no debts, you can live on less. So how many Albertans now are not making, as a household, making $70,000? Those are the kind of practical questions we can ponder right now in this emergency. But it wouldn't be cool to have a litmus test or a barometer of hope right now. Because I ask those questions. I ask crazy questions like, when you wake up in the morning, how much love do you feel for yourself? Who would ever ask you that, class? Like maybe your wife or something. I don't know. But, you know, maybe those are, but my questions are based on the science of happiness, because I'm not a positive psychologist. So I have to rely on their expertise to say, I can only ask a few questions. So I only asked 36 questions in my survey. And the cool thing is those subjective questions line up with those GPIs now, right? Because I can ask how safe do you feel walking alone at night? And then the crime rates, right, of Edmonton or whatever. So I'm always trying to line up a perceptual right data point with the objective data that we're continually collecting. Hope that helps.
Yeah.
Can I just have a short follow-up question?
Just a short one. We got to.
Okay, real quickly. I mean, I remember, you know, that of course across the country here, I mean, the economic conditions vary greatly, and so, I mean, I remember when there was growth of the oil sands, the tar sands. You know, the conditions here were so different than the rest of the country, and so,
yeah.
You know, like a low interest rates, for example, were beneficial perhaps in the eastern or in other parts of the country where the economy wasn't so hot, but were kind of detrimental here, where, I mean, the economy was so overheated and wages were so high, and you know, they had to end up going for temporary workers to go and get you know, meet the labor needs. So I presume that there would also be variations across, of course, in a GPI across the country. I was just wondering if you'd like to address that issue further.
Well, sadly, there are no other GPIs. Well, Nova Scotia had, Ron Coleman, my friend in Nova Scotia, tried for years because he was so excited about GPI, an Australian fellow. But there are actually no other provincial. BC has had some attempts. Hans Messenger, the guy who actually produced Canada's GDP numbers for Stats Can, did one for Canada a long time ago. But we naturally get criticized, right, by our economic colleagues for how dare you, you know, challenge the primacy of GDP and oh, after all, and then there's this kind of apology which says, well, GDP was never meant to measure welfare in the first place. I mean, just read Keynes, read Simon Kuznets, the guys who created the system. So when you look, but I've looked at levels of life satisfaction data across Canada. So I do have lots of data for Canada, and I could show you that the relationship between household income and life satisfaction as a relationship. So who's doing the best in Canada? Who's the happiest relative to income? Well, it happens to be, you might be surprised, Sherbrooke and Trois-Rivières. Happiest relative to income. They don't have the Alberta incomes we have, but they're relatively happier than we are. Go figure, right? Also with PEI, who has the lowest suicide rates in the country over the last 50 years? Prince Edward Island. Is it the cows? Is it the potatoes? I don't know. Something about PEI, right? So my point is, you can look at all of these 50 indices across the country and say, who's optimizing well-being?
Mm-hmm.
That's the question. It's not maximize, it's optimizing. Now, Bill and I know that Alberta made a big mistake, in my opinion, by allowing a generic orally oil regime to come into place in 1997, when my old thesis advisors, people like Dr. Percy and others, embraced the notion that we should open the floodgates to capital investment, and because our resource was underappreciated. And we then saw the consequence of that, which was an explosion of capital investment, unsustainable, not responsible. We have 200 years of the damn stuff in the ground. It's not going to go away. And I kept asking, what's the rush? And what happens? Wages inflate. Kids graduating out of old high school making $100,000 a year with too much money and drugs. And it's just like, are you kidding me? And then we don't even save enough, and we suck. Like, compared to Norway, I mean, and they, oh, you're a socialist. I said, really, Norway? Mr. Lougheed was a socialist because Norway took Lougheed's model and did better than. And they have $1 trillion in the bank, and we have 19 billion. Well, we're not a country. It's like, I don't care. Then team up with the prime minister and figure out how you're going to put $1 trillion away, because you could have and you didn't.
Yeah.
And now we're suffering. We were co-responsible for the situation. So I can be a raging critic of the system, which we adopted because we thought this was the rational thing to do.
Very good. So I got Martin, you're next. If anyone else wants to ask a question, we've got about 15 minutes. So if people want to put their names forward, then we'll just take a list. So Martin.
Thanks. I was interested, Mark, in your little kind of offhand comment about GAI or UBI versus employment, and how superior employment is to being on the dole. I wonder if that means that you're anticipating through the wonderful world of co-op businesses, we can get back to the kind of economy where everybody can in fact have a job. Or if not, then it's fine to talk about the superiority of employment, but if in fact there aren't jobs for everybody, and from now on, at least in the short term, there are going to not be jobs for even more people. Is UBI perhaps at least a temporary solution or a temporary step in lieu of the perfect state? Or do you actually anticipate that, how would we get back to full employment where everybody has a job?
That's a great question. I've done a lot of thinking of that, and I've come at it from a few angles. One is, if anyone knows Stefano Zamagna's work in Emilia-Romagna, in Bologna, he came up with this notion called the social quality market, where every person, whether they're catatonic or have 3 PhDs, has something to contribute. They have an asset. We all have time. That's the only thing we have in common. The average male in Alberta has 740,000 hours of life to live. And a third of that you'll sleep, I hope. And you'll sleep like a baby. But so if this notion of a social rate, and it wasn't just theoretical, saying, and he said, if every person derives dignity from work to contributing something of their time, their skills, their competencies, then everyone has a right to a living wage. And every business person should be cognizant of what that living wage is. So I think the onus is on business to ensure your employees are now. So I think the UBI is a temporary. So let me say that I think full employment is possible, even under artificial intelligent future. I always joke, I say, what happened to original intelligence? But whatever, we got artificial intelligence. And even under enormous efficiencies. Now, here's the thing that I like to point out that very few economists will ever look at. The problem with money itself, debt money. Now, I just said 98% of money is created when banks issue loans. So it's all debt money. And with the debt money comes interest obligations, even at 2% lower interest rates. Since World War II in the United States, and same in Canada, the amount of debt has been doubling around every 7 to 8 years. Okay, why is that important? The debt, collective debt, is $74 trillion in the United States. There's interest charges associated with all that debt, but there's no official statistic on the interest charges. I mean, governments maybe report interest, but even the US government reports something called net interest. That is a weasel word. I want gross interest. I want the gross interest payments on the debt that the United States federal government has. I want the gross interest paid by households and businesses and the foreign debt. And when you do the math, which I've done because there's no official number, we can also say that for every dollar of income earned now, a big or a portion of that is going to pay for interest charges on the debts that the banks created. And I'm pointing to the banks because we gave up the power of money creation a long time. In the US, it was 1913 with the Federal Reserve. So Americans don't even know their history. That's aside. So I can calculate that right now, as of today, the third quarter reporting Federal Reserve statistics, they actually brag about how much debt is outstanding in the United States. That number is around 45 cents on every dollar of median pre-tax income of the American household is going to pay for interest charges on the total debt. Because it's embedded. It's embedded in taxes, it's embedded in your Starbucks, it's embedded in your mortgage. I'm like, wait a minute, think about that. That means that almost half of your work week was going to pay for interest charges on money debt that was not even necessary had the central bank, a public bank, issuing the money for the people of the nation. It's just outrageous. So you say, if I was running for president in November, I might campaign on a 2.5-day work week because I would try to start to nationalize all the debt and retire it, just like China does, by the way. That's what's so unique about China. People don't understand what they're doing because they adopted Mr. Lincoln's model before Mao. So this is the kind of game that's going on. So I can imagine that it would be relatively easy to pay. Now, I said right now the happiness wage is $40 an hour, right? For per person, 2 couples working. At $20 an hour, that would be, without debt, of course, that would be maybe a universal, a kind of let's call it a well-being income, or at the very least, a portfolio of well-being, attributes that make life possible and flourishing. Now, the transition to that state, I mean, you might think I'm just dreaming in color, and I probably am, because it's probably not going to happen, right? Because it wouldn't require a global agreement to move in that direction. But can we move in that direction? And one of the arguments I've made is that Alberta itself is in a unique position because we have the largest public bank in North America called the Alberta Treasury Branch. And I'm like, neither premiers, both Notley or Kenney, understand anything about what it means to have a public bank. It's unbelievable because they don't even read the act. Read the act of the Alberta Treasury Branch. And you can't tell me that Alberta right now could issue money at no cost based on the proper balance sheet and assets of this province. And the same would be true of Canada with its central bank. And the two could be working in concert, and every province should have a public bank. In the US, the governor of New Jersey right now campaigned on the creation of a public bank, and we're helping them. And we're like, look, Alberta. They look at, you kidding me? You have a $50 billion full financial service public bank? Yeah, better than North Dakota. They can't believe it. And we talk about privatizing it. It's just, these are the things that just enrage me, I guess, as an economist. And we're not, it's not like I'm not blowing anything up here. I'm just saying use the power that already exists. So
that's great. Thanks, Mark. So we're just 3 minutes to 2. So I think Klaus has a question. Why don't we take that question, and then I was told we're wrapping up around 2 o'clock, but we're going to probably go a bit beyond that if people are okay. So Klaus, your question, and then
I have one, just a quick comment and then a question that gets more into the weeds of things. But remember when I first started working, and one of my early bosses was Dave Panner, and the philosophical question that he and I kept getting into is, how much is enough? And it's always that thing is, what would you do and what would you set up? And the sarcastic answer was a little bit more than what I have, was always the thing to do that. But what I'd like to talk about, and I think you guys are both talking similar things, but in different ways. I've been talking to, and I don't know if you know Robert McGarvey.
Robert and I are good friends, yeah.
And he's been talking a lot about intangible assets. And to me, a lot of the things that you've been espousing in terms of, human capital, happiness, that sort of thing, are intangible. They're not the type of things where we've normally looked at it. You have to be able to do something with the asset. It has to be physical. It has to be done. But companies like Google, most of their wealth, if you look at it from a market cap perspective, is intangible. It's not in buildings or roads or that sort of the things. And having worked with Robert and Don Diduck, we've been with new startup companies. There's been a lot of talk about quantifying those intangible assets, being able to sort of almost have a parallel set of books, that one for the tax department and one for the investor sort of thing. Just wonder what your thoughts on that approach is.
Well, Robert and I drank a lot of scotch together, so we have the same Kool-Aid in our system. Actually, he was one of the very few people, other than Martin, I think, that I've had unbelievable conversations about money. Right? McGarvey knows the money system. Very few economists do. He's an economic historian. So when we met, we both, out of our mouths came the word assets, right? And Joe Batty, Joe, he's former CFO, he's a legitimate CPA, accountant, former CFO of Nate. Joe taught me a lot. And what was the point that both McGarvey and Batty are saying is these intangible assets, just like property rights or intellectual property or ideas or patents, are legitimate assets that belong on the balance sheet. They are collateral grade assets. Trust is an asset that can actually be quantified or at least experienced. And so they are legitimate asset classes that demand an accounting of, and as some people are saying, that these intangibles might make up 50% of a corporation's balance sheet. I mean, look at Coca-Cola. How does Warren Buffett know the brand? How does it trust the accounting of the brand value of Coca-Cola? Don't know. I mean, Warren has an incredible sense of understanding intangible assets from the corporate culture. Just has a sense. Can he quantify it? Can Charlie Munger and him put a number on it? Specific, probably not. But anyways, the point is that in the realm of accounting and banking, I think these intangible assets can and should be measured. And that's what I'm getting at. It's like I can ask you questions about your, I did a major project with the Capital Region Housing Corporation where we asked their tenants about their well-being. And I said, now that means we can measure the relationship between the building they live in, possibly, and their subjective well-being. And that belongs on the balance sheet. That's the basis of accounting for funders of whether we're making a difference in people's lives. So again, we're in complete agreement. But as Joe and Robert know, we also have to set precedent. We can't, and we need the accounting firms to back us to say, as I said earlier, I don't care which accounting firm accepts the possibility of creating a new balance sheet for a First Nation, but whoever does it, and I was told by the Standards Board in Toronto, once you put natural capital as an asset, you've set precedent, and you basically ignored the word prohibition. And here we go. Let's do it.
And would that change the way of the term asset management or creating assets in terms of how you would conduct yourself moving forward?
Well, remember I said earlier, all wealth comes from God. We didn't create anything, and that's what Indigenous people say too, Look, when you sit with Indigenous people, what do? They start with smudging and ceremony. They always thank the Creator. But how do we start, with Robert's rules or something? I don't know. Who is Robert anyways? And, it's the attribution, and on the balance sheet, Luca being a Catholic, monk, it was like in the day, in nominos, right? In the year of our Lord. So there was always an attribution to the Creator of the wealth that came from the Creator. So this notion of we make money. No, we don't make money. Did we create the asset? No, I mean, one of the characteristics of McGarvey says an asset is something you own or can manage. Okay, sure. Is the land under my feet something I created? No, it's not. I didn't build this house. I maintained this house. Did I create my intellect? No, I didn't. I sat at the feet of my teachers and learned by osmosis. So this notion of we're creating wealth, we're creating, I just think it's not true. But that's exciting because that means we all have something to contribute. Like in Indigenous culture, when Chief Sinclair says, "I'm not chief," that's a colonizer word. I'm a leader for this time, but you're a leader too, Klaus. You have knowledge or asset, skills, competencies, right? That contributes hopefully, and that's the spirit I think of cooperatives, is that when we share these assets, we're stronger, and we don't all have to be the same.
I was going to ask you early about the question, I know that I'm jumping in a little bit here, but about what unify us as humans. And I think you just touched a little bit on that. Unfortunately, time is not on our side, though we could extend this and go on a little longer. It's entirely up to people, of course. But I was wondering if Cindy and Justin have perhaps a desire to ask a question. You certainly will be welcome, Cindy and Justin. And maybe Louis, if feel free to jump in, compared with your many, many years of cooperative development experience. I'm sure you can illuminate some aspect of what Mark has touched upon.
Oh, by the way, Randall, I have nothing but time, so I don't care how, as long as it's not, digging into my cocktail hour or something.
Why don't we say we'll go for another 15 minutes then, and Leo's pushed out to Cindy or others who haven't had a chance to ask a question. Do you want to comments, or even it doesn't have to be a question?
You can unmute.
Yep.
Yeah, I guess I don't have a question per se. I probably have a couple of books to read. Very interested, and a lot of this stuff is, super important, and it's just exciting to kind of be a part of it and listen in, to be honest, but nothing, not a question. I'll probably think of that shortly after we end the call.
Well, thank you for being the, part of the distribution of age cohorts in this otherwise wise group of people. I'm glad you said it's exciting, because I'm excited. Like, this isn't going to be easy, but it's like, wow, we could rethink a lot of things. It's like an examination of conscience going on here. Yes. There's a spiritual dimension to going on here. And I always hope, like, let's not get back to what was too quickly. Let's just really pause here and rethink a lot of the structures that we're born into, like Neo in the Matrix. It's like, or the Truman Show. It's like,
Yeah, that's very good. Any other people, Louis, others that have questions or comments?
Well, I could certainly talk for hours about cooperatives. This is what my wife tells me all the time. But fundamentally, you look at the nature of the cooperative business, which is there to serve the needs of its members.
And although we're having discussions here in Calgary about Calgary Co-op, but that's another story altogether. Fundamentally, if you look at the 7 principles, the 7th principle is concern for community, not just the members. You know, you talk about equity, you talk about equality, but equity in the sense of the co-op isn't how much investment you have, it's how equitable is the redistribution of any of the profits at the end of the road. I liked your comments about the public banks. You know, you think about the Bank of, what was it, North Dakota or South Dakota?
North Dakota.
South, okay. And you got the Ellen Brown's discussions and some of the former leadership candidates for the Democratic Party that are talking about that. We know that banks have been allowed to lend multi times the amount of money that they have, and therefore making profit on money that doesn't exist, on creation of credit that they're cashing in on, that the governments are paying interest on, but that was never actually exchanged. So there's a lot of questions that come from that. My wife is very interested in that particular subject, such as was her mom also. And the question comes back since 1974, if I remember correctly, when Pierre decided to follow suit with, oh, well, you know, let's give it all to the private banks. All that interest could have served, like it does in North Dakota, the needs of the community, the needs of society, the needs of Canada, Canadians. There's a lot to talk about, and obviously I'm not going to talk about all that today, but I think that what you've exposed today is really interesting, and I certainly hope to hear more. Although being in Calgary, I don't have the opportunity to go up to Edmonton as often as I would like, especially not now. Even though I work a lot with the Francophone community, there's a lot to be learned from each other to be able to meet each other's needs, and how do we proceed from that. So the cooperative model, to me, looking at Mondragon, looking at Italy for the different models in Italy and all that, and around the world, there's a lot more depth to the cooperative movement around the world than the average citizen knows. Just to give you an idea, I opened up the Southern Alberta office for the Francophone Economic Development Company organization. And my colleague basically told me that he was taught, when he was doing his commerce degree, one of his professors was going to give a talk about co-ops, and the talk was, they don't work. That was it. That demonstrated an ignorance on the part of the professor, for one thing, but also an ideological bent that doesn't recognize that people who have needs can work together to solve their needs. They don't need to have somebody else come. You know, there's the distinction between the citizen and the consumer. And we know the different models in the cooperatives are not just consumer co-ops, but we're all citizens, and it's our responsibility to take on the needs and what we have for problems in our society, so we can get together in a co-op and do something like that. Anyway, I've talked enough. I'm going to let you argue with me.
Oh, I would not argue. I would just nod and say, we've done a lot of analysis. You know, Bob Ask and I did a forensic assessment of ATB and said, you know, we've had 80 years of it, and we're actually much more robust than the Bank of North Dakota in some respect, except the Bank of North Dakota actually lends to the state infrastructure lending at no interest, which it can do. It just has to recover its operating costs. And I made that point. Banks don't have to charge interest at all. They're just operating like any business and recover their operating costs. Simple, right? Yeah, right. But so we're on the same page there. I wanted to say that one of the companies that I come to love in Edmonton, Shandos Construction. So Tom Reddle, and Martin, you probably know him. I don't know, Bill, if you met Tom, but he's been CEO of Shandos, and I met him at a Catholic fundraiser one day through his wife, and I felt like the Gillette commercial, and his wife introduced him to me and said, this is my husband, Tom. He's from Saskatoon. I said, oh, the Holy Land. No, I'm just kidding. And, and and Tom said, yeah, I read your book, The Economics of Happiness, and I completely bought your idea of the Mondragon model, and I'm experimenting with Shando. So I've created a worker cooperative business structure, and we created a financial trust, which eventually went offside against Harper's finance minister, but because of all the trust issues that were going on. But I thought, wow, and his point was it was all founded on the primacy of labor, the dignity of work, the dignity of labor, that every worker was given an option to opt in as a unit holder of the trust of Shandos, right? So 6 months. And then that pooled investment was working for the collective. And it was also the basis of then being able to take personal development, go off, you're a fine carpenter, and go off and take, more, whatever, go to Venice or something. And he said it really was successful. And even though they don't, announce that they're cooperative, but they are very successful. Now they're leading the country in terms of integrated project delivery, which is this new way of, building and actually getting along before a project starts, right? So they're one of my favorite models in Alberta. So
that's exciting. Very good. There's all kinds of amazing things going on. And as you've highlighted, Mark, I think we are in unprecedented times where people are looking for new models and new ways of coming out of this. The old normal was not great and equitable for so many people. And so I think we need voices like you and Wayfinders Business Cooperative folks and others to be pushing those new ideas going forward, because it's in these times when new ideas are actually implemented and show a better path forward. So that's very exciting, and I'm very glad you're able to join us here today.
Can I say one thing? I know it sounds really cheesy, but I've been playing with this idea. There was who asked the question about what unites us, right? And I've been thinking about that a lot, because we've had a little program called What Now on YouTube, and we're interviewing people from around the world. And one of the interesting things is when, Kiara Lubitsch, who started the Focolare and the economy of, what do you call it? Economy of communion, that's right. Which started in Brazil. When she went to Brazil, she's now deceased, but she saw there was an opportunity to create a new economic system. And she said, it has to be based on love, and compassion. And so I think there are these, I know it sounds corny and cheesy, maybe, but why not? Why not think about this notion of compassion?
Mm-hmm.
We're all in this together. We'll get through it. We're all going to die eventually anyway. So, but let's
some of us timers will say that school of thinking comes from liberation theology in the 60s and 70s.
Yes, of course.
And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because Brazil was definitely part of that.
I have a bit of a beef with, three of my female friends said one day they all had these separate dreams. I'm going to advise Pope Francis. I'm like, oh yeah, sure. And then my friend Bea from Edmonton said, I'm off to Rome. I said, you are? It's like, I don't know. It's just a crazy idea, but take my book. I'm going to write a private letter to the Pope, and I'm going to offer my services like Naomi Klein did, actually, and say, I want to work with you to end usury for the whole planet.
Beautiful.
And really live the Lord's Prayer, which says, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. The original line, not trespasses. I said, I don't know what a trespass is. But Francis, are you willing to, let's do this, right? And of course, no response. So I challenge my own Catholic faith and say, who's going to lead? How are we going to solve this big international debt problem, if not to acknowledge that we all need debt jubilee? Let's start again. Let's reboot the whole damn thing. Because we're stuck. There's no way out of this dead-end street. So that's an act of mercy and love. So that's my challenge to.
Beautiful.
Mark, thank you so much for being with us. we hope to have you back and explore this a little further in some fashion as well, because one thing that keeps going on in my head, and eventually I'm going to have a conversation with some close friends as well on it, is what unify us as humans, and that's an important question I think to address in the next little while. Hopefully, leading to some kind of big gathering or series of gatherings, in the next few months, once that becomes possible, obviously, and it's begin to redesign and not just rebuild, but build something anew, refreshing, based on also on our learnings and our recent experience. Hopefully, Mark, we can have you back at some point, and sincere appreciation for taking the time to being with us. And thank you again. Gracias.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mark. Randall?
Yeah, thank you all, and thank you, Mark, especially for leading this cause not only locally and regionally, nationally, but internationally, because I think it is almost a tragic statement that humanity has kind of gotten transfixed on currency itself rather than the things that currency is supposedly to buy us, and the things that we are really looking for in life, that is our core values, meeting our human needs. So bringing the conversation back to something that earlier humans understood implicitly is definitely a good turn. And we're going to try to work as a co-op to implement this kind of comprehensive balance sheet accounting, and work with you and anyone else who's willing to try to implement this, so we can lead the way, whatever way we can, and ensure that those basic needs are first and foremost on our minds, that the economy revolves around those core values and not the distractions that money is. So I'd like to thank you and all of you, and hopefully we can have you back again at another time. In the meantime, I'll leave you with the way we came together, sharing in the bowl, again symbolizing the gathering of our souls in a mindful moment, sharing our best thoughts and feelings. And with that, I think if we have nothing more, Bill, we will close on this note.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was fun. We'll see you next time.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.